With so many live service games vying for your attention, the First Descendant feels like it was focus group tested to please as many people as possible, and it's fated for mediocrity as a result. This unabashedly derivative shooter borrows tired ideas from better games, covers them in a thick layer of free-to-play annoyances, then pads the whole thing out with mind-numbingly repetitive missions just in case you were still managing to have fun. That's unfortunate, because underneath all that cheap wood and crumbling drywall is a really strong foundation, with entertaining gunplay and charismatic characters I'd like to get to know better. The First Descendant is by no means the first live service game to come out of the oven half-baked, so there's always a chance updates will make it more palatable in the months and years to come, but it's off to an underwhelming start.
Oh, how the weak struggle to define their purpose. Humans truly are foolish animals.
Developer Nexon's take on a multiplayer third-person shooter plays in some of the same spaces as Genshin Impact, complete with cool-looking characters to unlock and countless currencies and materials to grind for, all of which can be bypassed if you're willing to simply cough up your hard-earned cash. And like some of its polished contemporaries, there's a pretty decent game here in spite of a UI that requires a PhD in RPG hogwash to decipher, and an irritating monetization model. Running around with friends while shooting enemies and unleashing interesting supernatural abilities upon alien armies is an undeniably good time, and the deep RPG mechanics and loot systems are a spreadsheet-loving nerd's dream. It's also a fairly pretty game that feels a lot more premium than one might expect, even with the occasional frame rate dip or crash. That said, its monetization model is every bit as eyebrow-raising as it sounds. The story and dialogue is laughably bad, and much of the campaign is packed with filler that can be a real snooze. I've spent the vast majority of my 120 hours of playtime dashing around small hub areas, completing repetitive chores in between much more substantial missions and boss battles against robotic kaiju. Those self-contained missions and bosses are exactly the kind of thing I hope for in an action-packed cooperative game. Some seriously awesome combat, interesting enemies to take down, and a loot system that had me regularly trying out the latest shiny weapon I pulled from some schmuck's corpse. That said, even these more enjoyable bits weren't without major irritations, like how nearly every boss has multiple layers of shielding that have to be peeled off before they can be damaged, most of which respawn multiple times or heal if you take too long to remove them. A few even have shields on top of their shields, so you're constantly stopping what you're doing to shoot a tiny target and remove a protective barrier, only to find yourself staring at another one seconds later. But those are still bright spots compared to the much more numerous missions you're expected to do in between every story beat, which have you grapple hooking across open world areas to complete intensely monotonous errands. These include a little mini-game where you have to collect items from fallen enemies and deposit them into a collection bin, an escort quest where you have to follow a drone around an area slowly while fighting small waves of baddies, and several variations of missions where you're just standing in a circle as you keep it clear of foes. Not only do most of these involve a whole lot of waiting around for enemies to spawn, but you'll replay them in every new area until they are both tiresome and woefully predictable. There are so many missions like these, and it adds hours upon hours to a roughly 30-hour campaign that would probably be a quarter as long if they just went straight to the stuff that's actually worth playing. Even if you can forgive the often trite missions, the story itself is consistently a waste of time and absolutely not worth paying attention to. Absolutely brimming with nonsensical sci-fi babble like dimensional walls, inverted data codes, and unleashing Arche, it's one of the sillier stories I've seen in a while, and I play Destiny. Most of the dialogue is absolutely atrocious. At one point, I burst out laughing when a guy said this:
"Kickoff will engulf increase. The roars of the Vulgus will fill this land with fear."
And they keep making you talk to this annoying little brat. It's truly heinous stuff.
I'd watch what you're saying, Glay. I carried out my side of the operation perfectly.
Thankfully, the most interesting characters are those you can unlock and play as. That includes the unflappable electric speedster Bunny, who is my personal favorite, and the sarcastic and smarmy grenade-chucking soldier Lepic. Some of the casts do still seem a bit shallow, largely because you only get a little backstory and character development for most of them, but hearing them cheer as you blast monsters to bits and seeing their charming animations, which clearly had more effort put into them than those of the NPCs, is quite nice. Only one of these playable characters has an actual quest line associated with them right now, with more planned for the future, but that story is one of the better threads currently available, so here's hoping they're quick to add more on that front.
Oh, my beloved daughter Daya. Hold on a little longer. Your mom will save you no matter what.
Actually learning to play as them is great too. One character might control the battlefield with explosive AoE attacks, while another covers enemies in devastating ice-based debuffs. Bunny does insane DPS by running around as much as possible to generate electrical energy, then unleashes it in powerful blasts. Since each of these characters has their own style of play, switching between them offers a markedly different experience, like how Ajax, a heavy tank with protective abilities, is all about standing your ground instead. Most games with playable characters as its main chase live or die by how compelling those unlockable avatars are, and the First Descendant is loaded with distinctive options that are alluring to obtain. Unfortunately, aside from the first couple characters you unlock in the opening hours, the process of accessing the rest is dreadfully painful unless you're willing to open your pocketbook. In the name of science, I decided to really dial in and see how much effort it would take to unlock one specific character from start to finish without spending any real money. After 10 hours of repetitive grinding for the required materials, a whopping 8 of which was spent replaying a single mission trying to get one specific key item to drop, and then 20 more hours of waiting for arbitrary time gates to pass, the experience had nearly broken me. I've got to admit, when the alternative to all of this mindless, soul-destroying grinding and time gating is to simply pay $10, it becomes a pretty appealing proposition to cough up the dough. And that's the problem. Nexon has intentionally propped up obtuse, overly grindy systems that feel terrible, seemingly just to make it more enticing to pay money. And when there are already paid season passes and a whole slew of optional cosmetics that can only be unlocked with money, did it really need to throw in what is essentially an even more grindy version of Warframe's character unlock system just to annoy me into paying more on top of that? Either way, trying to unlock a single character for free was an absolutely excruciating experience that made me feel a whole lot worse about the First Descendant despite mostly enjoying the actual gameplay.
Do as I say, if you want to live.
Similarly, the weapons, equipment, and upgrades you earn while shotgunning your way through levels are awesome. Loot drops constantly, most weapons feel distinct and satisfying to play with, and watching the numbers go up as you modify and upgrade every new toy in your arsenal makes the First Descendant hard to put down, until it forces you into about 15 separate menus to juggle dozens of materials and so many different systems that you might want to keep your inhaler at the ready. This kind of thing is pretty typical for looter shooters, granted, but even by the already gag-inducing standards of the genre, this one's particularly obnoxious to learn, especially since the tutorial robot who shows you the ropes in the social area explains things to you in a series of texts that pass by quickly enough to challenge your speed reading skills. Worse yet, these brutally obtuse systems have likewise been given the same arbitrary barriers as weapons, with various currencies and components to craft that can be made a whole lot less annoying if you just pay the piper. The First Descendant has all the building blocks of a fantastic looter shooter, but they're buried under a pile of monotonous quests, a terrible story, and an infuriating free-to-play model that has influenced its game design in the worst possible way. In its best moments, blasting aliens apart with both fireballs and a satisfying arsenal of weapons makes for a really good time, but at least an equal portion of my time was spent battling perplexing design decisions that tested the limits of my abundant patience. Like its peers, future updates could evolve this live service into a much more consistently enjoyable way to spend time with friends, but for now, it misses the mark too often to make its grind feel worthwhile. For some recent live service alternatives, check out our reviews of Zenless Zone Zero or Destiny 2: The Final Shape. And for everything else, stick with IGN.